And good evening tonight from Warsaw, Poland. We're not far from where we're standing right here tonight. President Biden on the world stage today at a pivotal moment in the war in Ukraine, now set to mark 1 year since Russia's invasion. 30,000 people gathered to hear President Biden address our NATO allies, Ukraine, Americans back home, and of course, much of the speech directly squared directly at Vladimir Putin, what the president said to the Russian people directly. And after the president's secret and historic trip to Kyiv, the president saying Kyiv stands proud, it stands tall, and most important, it stands free. The president saying Ukraine defying expectations this past year, that democracies are stronger and NATO is more united than ever. The president repeatedly calling out Vladimir Putin and his, quote, war of choice, saying that if Russia stopped, the war would be over. But that, quote, if Ukraine stopped defending itself, it would be the end of Ukraine. But the president also preparing the U.S. and its allies for a difficult road ahead, saying the defense of freedom is not the work of a day or of a year, promising the U.S. will always have Ukraine's back. And just hours before President Biden's speech, Vladimir Putin delivering his own address, defiant, blaming the West, and Putin suspending the START treaty, the nuclear arms treaty with the U.S. The president ending his speech here joined by children, calling this moment an inflection point, a choice between hope and fear, between democracy that lifts up the human spirit and the brutal hand of the dictator who crushes it. It was a defining moment. Tens of thousands watching here in Warsaw. ABC senior White House correspondent Mary Bruce leading us off here in Warsaw tonight.
President Biden tonight with a rallying cry for America's allies.
1 year ago, the world was bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Well, I just come from a visit to Kyiv, and I can report Kyiv stands strong. Kyiv stands proud. It stands tall. And most important, it stands free.
The president hailing the NATO alliance that has only grown stronger in the face of Russia's aggression.
There should be no doubt. Our support for Ukraine will not waver. NATO will not be divided, and we will not tire.
But the president was also blunt, preparing allies and Americans for a long road ahead.
We have to be honest and clear-eyed as we look at the year ahead. There will continue to be hard and very bitter days, victories and tragedies. But Ukraine is steel for the fight ahead. And the United States, together with our allies and partners, are going to continue to have Ukraine's back as it defends itself.
Standing in Vladimir Putin's backyard, Biden called out the Russian leader by name more than 10 times, declaring Putin underestimated the resolve of the free world.
He thought autocrats like himself were tough and leaders of democracy were soft. Autocrats only understand one word: no, no, no. No, you will not take my country. No, you will not take my freedom. No, you will not take my future.
Just hours earlier in his annual address to the Russian people, Putin accused America and its allies of conspiring against his country. Insisting Western elites make no secret of their goal of inflicting a strategic defeat to Russia, saying they intend to transform a local conflict into a phase of global confrontation. He did not mention Biden by name, but he did take a clear shot at America, announcing Russia is suspending participation in the new START arms treaty with the U.S., designed to limit production of long-range nuclear missiles. Soon after, Biden speaking directly to the Russian people.
The United States and the nations of Europe do not seek to control or destroy Russia. The West was not plotting to attack Russia, as Putin said today.
The president making it clear one person could end this war right now.
This war is never a necessity. It's a tragedy. President Putin chose this war. Every day the war continues is his choice. He could end the war with a word.
And so let's bring in Mary Bruce here in Warsaw tonight. And Mary, I know the Biden administration is now responding to Putin's words today that Russia is suspending its participation in that major nuclear weapons treaty.
David, the Secretary of State today calling this move deeply unfortunate and irresponsible. This is the last remaining treaty regulating the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. The fear is if Putin follows through on this and leaves this treaty, it could lead to a nuclear escalation, just as Russia is desperately looking for a way to win this war. David.
All right, Mary Bruce leading us off here tonight. Mary, thank you. And as you heard Mary report there, Vladimir Putin delivering a defiant speech today, also vowing to stand firm. Our chief foreign correspondent, Ian Pano, live in Kyiv tonight. And Ian, it was a remarkable split screen of sorts today. Two leaders standing up to one another, and for many, eerily reminiscent of the Cold War era.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if President Biden was trying to rally America and its allies, Putin was trying to rally Russia. He was as defiant as ever, again blaming the US and NATO for starting a war he said was aimed at Russia's strategic defeat. And I think despite a year of battlefield humiliations, he showed no signs of backing down, no easing in tensions either, with Putin even appearing to make thinly veiled nuclear threats. And while he was speaking, his army was again shelling civilians in liberated Kherson. With China's foreign minister in Moscow now for meetings tomorrow amid US warnings against supplying weapons to Russia, you're right, it's been a day of Cold War echoes, even as Putin makes it totally clear he's ready as ever to fight for a very long time here in Ukraine. David?
Ian Pano live in Kyiv for us tonight. Ian, thank you. And one more note before we move on to the other news back home tonight. President Biden made it a point here today to thank Poland for welcoming 1.5 million refugees from Ukraine. We have traveled to the war zone several times this last year. You'll remember our first trip right after Russia invaded Ukraine, the refugees we met, mothers and their children on those packed trains coming across the border. On another trip, our visit to what was once a theater built by Ukrainians turned into a shelter for mothers and their young children. The humanitarian costs of this war. I want to bring in ABC's chief global affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, with me here in Warsaw. And Martha, it was a striking moment, the president thanking the people of Poland, but also those sobering words about what could be a very long road ahead.
And it could be a very long road, David. We've both seen these refugees so many times. My first experience crossing the border right after the invasion and seeing those mothers, those wives say goodbye to their husbands, their sons, their fathers who stayed to fight. 8 million refugees left Ukraine. But what is very heartening is so many people came back. So many people wanted to stay in Ukraine, fight for their country, support their country, David.
And we'll stay on it, of course. I know you're traveling.
Starting in Europe today. Russia has said that it will abide by nuclear rules despite suspending its nuclear New START treaty with the United States. Russia said that it will still respect limits on nuclear missiles and inform the United States about changes in its deployments. Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda has asked United States President Joe Biden to deploy more NATO military equipment in the Baltic states. Biden met the leaders of Eastern NATO countries, including Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, in Warsaw yesterday. He restated the United States' commitment to NATO.
NATO's eastern flank, you're on the front lines of our collective defense. The commitment of the United States to NATO, and I've said it to you many times, I'll say it again, is absolutely clear. Article 5 is a sacred commitment the United States has made. We will defend literally every inch of NATO.
European Union countries met yesterday to discuss new sanctions against Russia, but they did not reach an agreement. The proposed sanctions include more than 10 billion euros in trade curbs. The countries have planned more talks to have the sanctions ready for the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on Friday. Asia. South Korea's fertility rate has decreased to a record low. South Korea already has the world's lowest fertility rate. In 2022, the number of babies that a woman is expected to have in her life reached 0.78. This means that South Korea's population is decreasing. The global average fertility rate is around 2.4. China and Japan held their first formal security talks in 4 years yesterday. The talks aim to reduce tension between China and Japan. China had said it was concerned about Japan's military build-up. Japan discussed China's military ties to Russia and suspected use of spy balloons. China is Japan's largest trading partner. In a statement after the meeting, Japan's foreign ministry said China and Japan have agreed to try to establish a direct hotline to strengthen communication. Africa. In Nigeria, 16 states are suing the central bank over the use of old banknotes. The withdrawal of old banknotes has caused shortages, and some citizens have attacked banks and cash machines. Nigeria's government said withdrawing the notes would help reduce money laundering and ransoms. The states have asked the Supreme Court to force the central bank to extend the use of old banknotes by 6 months. Nigeria's presidential election will be held on Saturday. Namibia is the first stop on United States First Lady Jill Biden's 5-day tour of Africa. The tour will focus on education, health, and empowering youth and women, and it will strengthen ties between the United States and countries in Africa. Yesterday, Biden went to the Heroes Acre War Memorial with Namibia's First Lady Monica Jengos. After Namibia, Biden will go to Kenya. The Americas. Canada's Defence Ministry has said it is aware of recent air and maritime surveillance attempts by China. In a statement, the military said that Canada has been stopping surveillance attempts since 2022. Canada is also facing rising numbers of asylum seekers from the United States. More than 39,000 refugees crossed into Canada last year, and more than 5,000 crossed last month. The Quebec government has said it can no longer accommodate them. United States Airlines have cancelled more than 1,300 flights due to a strong winter storm. In parts of the northern plains and upper Midwest of the United States, snow is falling at a rate of 2 inches per hour with gusty winds. And a NASA telescope has revealed data that might change how we understand the early universe. Researchers have discovered what look like 6 galaxies as mature as our Milky Way that existed 540 to 770 million years after the Big Bang. The observations suggest that large and mature galaxies may have existed earlier than scientists thought was possible. Scientists thought that galaxies took much longer to form.
Eurozone economies are proving so resilient, investors are ramping up bets that the European Central Bank will raise interest rates to all-time highs. The ECB long had some of the lowest interest rates and was seen as one of the world's most dovish central banks. But recent data shows strong service sector activity and demand for higher wages. Now, the ECB is expected to raise rates substantially. Swap markets are pricing in a jump in the ECB's deposit rate from the current 2.5% to 3.75% by September. That would match its peak back in 2001. That's when the ECB was still trying to shore up the value of the newly launched euro.
It's been 1 year since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the cost of that invasion has rippled out into so many different places.
We'll be examining the different layers of cost that this last year of war has had. To understand what's happened to Ukraine's economy, I spoke with the FT's Europe editor, Ben Hall. He says that first, we need more context.
Ukraine is one of the poorest countries in Europe, with a largely Soviet legacy economic structure, and it had been suffering the after effects of multiple crises through the 30 years of independence, starting with the hyperinflation and brutal transition after the collapse of communism and independence in the 1990s. Then the financial crisis, then a very, very severe recession after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and stirred up a war in the east of Ukraine, and then the pandemic.
For many years, Ukraine's economy has been dominated by the production of commodities. That's things like steel, coal, and agricultural crops. Those industries have been largely controlled by oligarchs, and that's led to corruption in business and politics.
These were men who made their fortunes through political connections largely, and then maintained their fortunes and increased their fortunes by using their political influence to make sure others did not challenge them. And it's one of the reasons that has held the Ukrainian economy back. It's made the economy uncompetitive because these are wealthy men who are trying to extract rents from their assets and don't want competition. And that has meant that the Ukrainian economy has lacked dynamism.
Still, at the end of 2021, just as Ukraine was emerging from the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic, things were starting to look brighter.
Ukraine was beginning to recover and was enjoying some kind of international investor interest as an emerging economy.
Then the invasion began.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a major military operation against Ukraine.
Russian tanks rolling across the border from Belarus in the north and Crimea in the south.
Millions of Ukrainians, mostly women and children, fled the country. 5 to 6 million more were internally displaced. Ben estimates that a third of all Ukrainian companies completely stopped production.
Then there was the direct impact of the fighting itself. Take Mariupol, for example, the city in the southeast of the country. The Ukrainians fought a last-ditch resistance in one of the steel plants there. Those two steel plants were essentially destroyed, and those two steel plants alone accounted for 40% of Ukraine's steel output. The Russians have also bombed all sorts of other bits of heavy industry, oil refineries, other industrial plants. Russia's effective blockade of the Black Sea has meant that it's been very, very difficult for the remaining factories working in Ukraine to actually export their goods of steel and farmers to export their grain. So even those bits of Ukrainian industry and agriculture that are working normally have really struggled to get their goods to market.
One bright spot in Ukraine's economy over the past year has been its technology sector.
It's been much easier for Ukrainian tech companies to keep going because workers with a laptop can essentially work from anywhere. So this sector has actually done pretty well and even appears to have increased its sales in 2022, and obviously now accounts for a much larger share of Ukrainian exports, which have overall shrunk because of the war. And I suspect what's happened is a lot of foreign companies have wanted to support Ukraine by employing the tech sector.
With the tech sector rising, power started shifting away from the oligarchs who held so much of it, especially away from the ones accused of supporting or colluding with Russia.
They will have had their TV stations shut down, or they will have been expelled from the country. But also those oligarchs who are not pro-Russian, who are Ukrainian patriots, have also suffered in this war, not least because many of their industrial assets have been badly damaged in the fighting, or their business activities have suffered because of the problems in getting exports out of the country, or because of other disruption caused by the war. You've seen the government, for example, seize and nationalize assets owned by oligarchs to serve the war effort. And I think you've seen a real shift in Ukrainian public opinion because of the war, which is a desire to want to see Ukraine change for the better over the longer term.
Ben says that the war has proven how resilient and adaptable the country can be. Still, As long as Russian missiles are battering Ukrainians and their infrastructure, this year is likely to be another grim one.
There's a huge backlog now of infrastructure that needs to be repaired and rebuilt, and that will probably take many months before that work even starts to happen.
That was the FT's Europe editor Ben Hall on this week's episode of Behind the Money, hosted by Michela Tindera. Today's episode also looks at the war's impact on food and energy prices and includes a conversation with a Ukrainian who lived through the initial attacks in Kyiv.
Well, President Biden and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin took aim at one another in fiery speeches today. Biden in Poland calling on the world to rally behind Ukraine, saying that global democracy is at stake and accusing Russia of crimes against humanity. And earlier today, Putin addressed his parliament with the announcement that the Kremlin would suspend its participation in the last remaining nuclear arms treaty between the U.S. and Russia. It's known as the New START Agreement. For more, we're joined on the KCBS Ring Central Newsline by Dr. Andrew Jenks, a Russian history scholar and professor at Cal State Long Beach. And Dr., your time is appreciated as always. So taking a look at Biden's speech, how did it go over for NATO countries? How did it go over in Moscow?
Well, for NATO countries, I think it was quite successful. And also, I think it played well politically back home. That is to say, in the United States, where there's always the danger of waning support for Ukraine. In terms of Moscow, I think it's fairly predictable. It didn't go over well at all. And the way that Russians see it, and in particular Putin, is that the United States is spearheading this takeover of Ukraine as a prelude to trying to invade Russia. That's the way that Putin spins it, and actually that propaganda is quite effective.
So overall, how would you rate Vladimir Putin's speech?
It is a speech that's almost unhinged, in fact, quite unhinged. Putin has gotten more and more aggressive. He's gotten more and more into saber rattling, into threatening nuclear weapons to be used in this conflict. And I think that's a sign of his desperation.
Talking about New START, what does this mean? I mean, he's saying a suspension, but he's not saying he's going to exit the agreement.
Yeah, I think that he has some limits, and he recognizes that to eliminate, to exit that agreement is to completely unravel the entire strategic arms control regime that has existed since the end of the Cold War, and that would be incredibly dangerous. Even Putin seems to recognize that.
President Biden is slated to meet with NATO leaders tomorrow. Do you expect something significant to come out of that meeting?
I think that what's going to come out of that is a renewed commitment to Ukraine and more weaponry that's going to be channeled into Ukraine. That's already been happening quite a bit. And I think that what we can wait for in the future is a continuing escalation. In fact, for the last year, that's what we've seen. Escalation after escalation after escalation, putting the United States into the position of being into direct conflict with Russia.
We've seen a very carefully choreographed sequence here between Biden going to Kyiv and then, of course, going to Poland and giving this speech. How much of this is directed at Europe and Moscow? How much of it is directed for us here at home?
Well, I think it's, killing two birds with one stone. It's directed, actually, you could say three birds with one stone. It's a message to Putin. It's a message to our European allies, and specifically to those that are bordering on Ukraine and on Russia. And it is, of course, something that's designed to try to consolidate support back home in the United States.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Dr. Andrew Jenks, Russian history scholar and professor at Cal State Long Beach.